All right. I'm going to be, if you want to follow along in your Bible, I'm going to be in 1 Timothy 1, verses 6 through 9. Some have departed from these and have turned to meaningless talk. They want to be teachers of the law, but they do not know what they are talking about or what they so confidently affirm. We know that the law is good if one uses it properly. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, and the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers. For the reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. So do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, or of me, his prisoner. Rather, join with me in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. He has saved us and called us to a holy life, not because of anything we have done, but because of his own purpose and grace. This grace was given us in Christ Jesus before the beginning of time.
Oh, thanks, Timothy. I put the wrong number down. So Timothy decided to give us a little bit of both Timothys today, and I appreciate him reading my mistake and then reading the correct version. It's good to see everybody. Hope you're all having a good start to your new year. New Year's resolution's already broken, right? It's the 7th. We're 1 week in. I assume so, at least. But man, it is good to be back. I want to take a moment to thank everybody for a generous gift for Yama as a congregation, for Delaney and I and our family. That's so kind of you. We're just so grateful to be a part of this congregation's story and their journey, and we are so excited to be a part of what's going to be happening here in 2024, and I know you are as well. I just want to kind of remind you, so we start off the beginning of every calendar year by doing a sermon series. This is like the 4th time in a row we've done this, that from January till Easter, we preach a sermon series on the given book that is being studied by our kids who are going through Bible Bowl and going through leadership training for Christ. So that is one book for 2 separate events that our 3rd through 12th graders are studying diligently. They have been since like October, I think, and they work really, really hard on it to both learn those scriptures and to find ways to which they can apply those scriptures to leadership skills and ways to serve congregations. And one of the things that I take a lot of pride in here at Centerville is that we put a lot of effort into having some solidarity with our younger people. We want to have a genuinely intergenerational congregation, right? We're not going to segment out our programs where the owls are doing this and the youth groups are doing that, and though we might have something here and there that are helpful for that, we try to be one cohesive family, yeah? And so what we try to do is we try to take a handful of weeks at the beginning of every year to study the same thing our young people are studying, to show them that, hey, we got your back and we care about you. And that way the parents have a little bit more info when the kids ask questions too. That helps as well. Right? So that's what we're going to be doing. With that said, I wish I'd planned a little better, okay? Because we've just finished like 8 or 9 weeks of the Minor Prophets, and now in 2024, we're jumping into another Old Testament book for another 12 weeks. And you know me at this point, right? I love the Old Testament. I think it has some beautiful ways of revealing God and pointing signposts to Jesus, and just shows us what God has been up to from the very beginning and what he is going to be doing at the end. I think it's all quite wonderful how it ties together. With that said, I know some Old Testament is a little bit intimidating and a little bit more difficult for some people. And generally speaking, I would like to be more balanced than doing 5 months of Old Testament at once. But I will say I've kind of got our sermon set up now till May of 25. and this is the last big Old Testament chunk you're going to get for like the next 16 months. So if this makes you kind of roll your eyes, you can take some solace in that at least. And so this year, with our young people, we are going to be studying the book of Exodus. All right, the book of Exodus, which is one of my personal favorites, my favorite from the Old Testament in general. Man, Exodus is just full of messages, plural, of salvation and covenant and God revealing himself to us and God wanting to share his presence with us and the fact that God wins over evil. I mean, there's just such a good story for the people of God throughout all the ages. And because of that, it's been, a really popular choice to insert into everyday culture, into pop culture, things like movies and songs. And I pretty much will judge you based off of when you picture Moses. Do you picture Charlton Heston or the cartoon Val Kilmer, right? That's kind of where we divide the line. Are you cartoon Moses or are you Charlton Heston Moses? And don't worry, I won't classify you. I am classifying you in my mind, but I won't tell you which one you are if you're on the fence for that. But there's just this wonderful story that has been put through so much of the church life and so much into our pop culture as well. And because of that, we're fairly familiar with most of the stories, right? We know about the plagues. We know about the Red Sea parting. We know about the 10 Commandments and them getting smashed and then Moses building them, making them again. We think about the golden calf. We think about Moses in a little basket floating down the Nile River. We have these key images in our mind, and we to an extent we know this story. But we forget that this is a 40-chapter book, okay? And while we might be able to lay out 7 or 8 key images or key parts of Exodus, there's so much deep nooks and crannies that we can dive into. And so we're going to do that for the next 12 weeks. For about 12 weeks, we as a church family, we're going to study this book, and we're going to hopefully find all sorts of wonderful applications that apply not just for those Hebrews back then, but for the church of Christ today, to come to better know this God of the Hebrews who fights for his people and desires to be close to them, right? And so we'll start this morning by just going into chapter 1. We're just going to stay in chapter 1 today, chapter 2 next week. Don't worry, it won't take 40 weeks, but chapter 1 today. Starting at the beginning, minus a handful of names that I didn't want to read in the first 5 verses. Starting in verse 6 then. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation, parentheses, who had come down to Egypt, right, died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Delaney and I have been fruitful and multiplied, and our 3-year-old might be coming down the aisle here in a second. That's okay. Does this sound familiar to you? Does this sound familiar? The Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Does that sound like anything else? How about Genesis chapter 1, right? Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. They were fruitful, increased in number, and filled the land, right? Isn't that cool? What we read here, what we're supposed to see, what the Jewish audience who would have been so familiar with Genesis chapter 1 would have read in Exodus chapter 1, is that here, when Israel was becoming a nation, this is no longer just an old man, Abraham. This is no longer just him and his kids. This is no longer a family. This is the beginning of a story of a new nation. And as they start to tell the beginning of the story of a new nation, they depict it in ways and words that paint the picture of a whole new creation. And I think that's intentional. Because Israel, as a nation, as a people, they were set aside to walk with God in a way that humanity was always supposed to, right? They were supposed to, God wanted Israel to almost be like a new humanity, a new creation that would follow through and be true to what humanity was always supposed to be with God. Like they're a microcosm of all that mankind was supposed to be. Not to make it too philosophical or anything, but I think that's what we're supposed to see. Israel was supposed to be a microcosm of what humanity was always supposed to be. And so here in these opening verses, we read that they're fulfilling that original mandate by God for all humanity. Mankind's first task in Genesis 1 was to be fruitful, to multiply and fill the earth. And here we are said that they are exceedingly fruitful. They are multiplying greatly, and that they are filling the land. And actually, land and earth in Genesis 1 are the same Hebrew word. And so they're fulfilling God's will. They are doing what humanity was always supposed to do. And we have to assume here, especially with the exceedinglys and the greats, and so numerous, that this is actually a blessing by God. That God is pouring out his blessings onto them, that they are growing at this incredible, miraculous rate. It is an increase given by God himself. And so what we see here is that it's a new creation, and almost like a new Eden in the land of Egypt that God had brought them to prosper in generations ago. Right? I mean, maybe you think I'm overselling that, maybe you don't, but I think that's what we're supposed to see as we start this book of Exodus. But what happened in Eden? God told them to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill the land. But then what happened next? There was a serpent, wasn't there? Right? There was a serpent. A snake wriggled in and worked to defeat God's life and help introduce death into the paradise. That's what Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is talking about. Well, in Exodus, we have a snake as well, right? We got a new snake. Picking up the next verse. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. And all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So instead of a crafty serpent, now in this story it has a shrewd Pharaoh who wants to put a stop to God's gift of life in the world. Yeah, the Pharaoh sees this miraculous sprouting of life for God's image bearers. His people are flourishing. And the only thing that Pharaoh wants to do in the face of God's gift, in the face of life, is bring death, right? To bring work and oppression and pain and suffering. He wants to put an end to God's blessing. Pharaoh in the Exodus story continually presents himself as kind of this anti-God position, combating God's will at every stop. When God gives life, Pharaoh deals out death. And in the next couple verses, we see that more explicitly, right? When he commands all of Egypt to sacrifice the baby boys. Yeah? When God gives life, Pharaoh deals out death. When God claims Israel as his son, Pharaoh claims them as his slaves. When God relents and shows mercy, Pharaoh grows harder and harder. Pharaoh is depicted as this anti-God, serpent-esque kind of figure in the book of Exodus. And as a people who know the larger story like we do, it's easy to see here a type, a literary, think back to your 10th grade English class, a literary type for Satan, right? The adversary who fights against God and his goodness in the world. And the thing is, that adversary, that anti-God figure shows up over and over and over again, not just in the Bible, but throughout all human history, right? You know, sometimes it's a serpent in a garden. Sometimes it's a Pharaoh in Egypt. Sometimes it's Cain in a field. Sometimes it's Judas in the temple court. Other times it's a Führer in Germany. Other times it's a terrorist with a gun. There will always be an embodiment of evil working against the life-giving gifts of God in the world. They've been there since the beginning, and they're going to keep on fighting against God's gifts until they are finally put under God's feet, which Revelation tells us will one day happen. And 1 Corinthians 15 tells us one day happen, and a whole lot of other verses tells us one day will happen. But until that moment, that evil will continue to pop up and to fight against life and light and God every chance they get. You know, in big ways and in small ways, the devil is still working to destroy the good things that God created and continues to create, right? But let me just kind of ask, with that in mind, what did we read in the story here? When the serpent-like figure, when the anti-God-like figure comes in to put death and destruction and a stop to birth, when God was giving life, what happened? Pharaoh's plans did not succeed. They didn't succeed, right? The more he tried to oppress and snuff out the gifts of God, the greater they grew. God's blessings and his purposes, they still prevail beyond any attempt of obstruction from the enemy. You know, God's blessings will not be outdone. God's purposes, God's will not be defeated. The pain that Pharaoh afflicted was real. Okay, the oppression, and like the text there is really trying to emphasize how rough that situation was. Talking about working them ruthlessly. And you can read, it's interesting, I went down this rabbit hole this week. You can read stories about modern day slaves in Pakistan being forced to work in brick factories, pretty much. Being forced to work in these places where they make the bricks, they dry the bricks, they put them in the kilns, and they are literal debt slaves that have to do this day in and day out, and it looks excruciating, this back-breaking, nasty work. The pain that Pharaoh afflicted was real, right? God in chapter 1, God doesn't swoop down and rescue them out of that suffering immediately. That's something we're going to have to face in Exodus 1 and in Exodus 2. But neither did he stop pouring out his blessings on them, right? God didn't swoop in and save them immediately. It was going to be a whole other generation before they walk out of those Exodus waters, the waters of the Red Sea. He didn't save them immediately, but neither did he stop pouring out his blessings on them, because God's good plans and his good gifts will not be defeated. And while we're kind of like focusing on that, I just kind of want to point out, it's important, I think, how we approach stories like this and the way we think about this kind of stuff. I think a lot of people would come to this story and think to themselves, well, why did God let them become slaves? Why did God let Pharaoh do that? Why would God create a world or put them in Egypt with those things that were going to happen to them? But I think that's the wrong angle. We're talking about things that God's not doing. Let's focus on the things that God did do. What did God do? He blessed them, right? He blessed them with a fruitful multiplication of children in a day and age where they weren't worried about overcrowding or anything like that. You know, the more children they had, the more powerful your nation was, the more better economics and sustainability and food and stuff like that you had. The more kids you had was a huge blessing in that time and age, and that's what God was giving them. God, the only thing he did was bless people, was increase their number, was help them fulfill their original human goal, right? To do good things for them. The slavery, the pain, the suffering, that all came from a human. It was a broken response to God's good blessings. God poured out blessings and goodness, and it was out of the fear and the brokenness and the fallenness of the humans around them that created a side effect to God's blessing, right? It wasn't God. We shouldn't be focusing on what God didn't do or why God didn't stop the free will human actions from happening. Let's focus on the fact that God did bless them. And then in a broken world, people were afraid of those blessings and reacted negatively. You know, we wouldn't want God to stop blessing us because it might lead broken people to do broken things, would we? You know, I don't think so. And I think about that in this situation, and I think about my situation. You know how many times I have complained and gotten mad about my cars breaking down? There's a curse in the Haynes household, Anthony knows this too, that we can't own working cars, all right? Something happens. I don't know what deal was made by our ancestors, all right? But when we own a car, it breaks down. But here's the thing. I've spent hours being bitter and mad and wondering why God would allow this starter to fail or that radiator to bust or whatever. I never focused on the fact that he blessed me with a car in the first place. That he put me in a land where, I mean, what percentage of the 8 billion people in this world have cars or have that kind of transportation, right? There's a blessing that is at the foundation that God has given us. And we so often forget about that to focus on what brokenness happened on top of that blessing, and we forget about the blessing. Something maybe for you to talk about in your small groups this evening. But like we said, you know, Pharaoh's aim was to destroy the life that God provided, and he failed. And so, because he failed, the snake strikes again. He's not going to let it go. He wants to destroy what God is doing, and so he's going to strike again. And just like Genesis chapter 3 now, just like Genesis chapter 3, who's he going to go after? I don't think it's a coincidence that in Exodus 1, like Genesis 3, the snake goes after some women to try to deceive them into putting some pain in God's paradise. Verse 15, which is the next verse again. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God, and they did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives can even arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. You see that? And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. One of the subtle things that I absolutely love about this story is the fact that we are not given Pharaoh's name. Did you ever think about that? It would make dating the book of Exodus a lot easier because there's a big fight over it was in the 1200 BCs or the 1400 BCs. We're never given Pharaoh's name. We get a lot of names in the Bible. I'm trying to do a read through the Bible plan this year for the first time in a handful of years. Reading through Genesis, I think it was 15 this week. Got a whole lot of names of a bunch of Mesopotamian kings that I do not care about. All right? There are names in the Bible where I don't necessarily think there has to be names. I'm sure God has a reason, but I at that moment I did not care. But I want Pharaoh's name. He's a pretty central figure. He's a pretty important person. I think it's crazy that we don't get Pharaoh's name, but I do think that part of that is so that we can see him as this universal, timeless embodiment of this anti-God, serpent-type figure that we've been talking about, right? I think that's part of it. I think he remains nameless so that we can see him as that timeless, universal figure of evil. But with that, along with that, I think the contrast right here is very important. We don't get Pharaoh's name, but we get those midwives' names, don't we? Shiphrah and Puah. Isn't that interesting? Wouldn't you think that it would be the powerful kingly Pharaoh who'd be important enough to have his name recorded for all history instead of these two lowly workers who only are a part of 6 verses of this story? Only 6 verses. It seems to me that in God's eyes, in the greater cosmic truth of this story, Shiphrah and Puah, they were the important ones. They were the most powerful and faithful and important ones in the story. That's really one of the main takeaway, I think, that I want us to take from chapter 1. God, he doesn't always step in right away. We all have had experience in our lives where we wish God would have stepped in with a miracle, and he didn't. He didn't in chapter 1. He doesn't in chapter 2. He doesn't always act in miraculous saving fashion for his people at first. But through his faithful followers, God's power and God's will is unleashed in the face of evil. Through his faithful followers, God's power and his will is unleashed in the face of evil. These unsuspecting, faithful women were the hands and feet of God to provide life and to provide salvation for his people in that place and in that time. They are the heroes of this story, God's deliverers in the story. No pun intended, because they were midwives, and they were his deliverers. Thank you. The pun wasn't intended when I wrote it down, but now it's intended, so you have to laugh at it. And these two women, they probably thought that they did not have a whole lot to offer God's kingdom. The fact that they were midwives suggests that they were probably barren, that they couldn't have kids, and so they probably felt like they couldn't contribute to God's mission in this time and place. Because the blessing that God is pouring out, the thing that God is doing for Israel in this time is what? Multiplying them, increasing them, right? As we focused on a little bit ago. And they couldn't participate in that. So they probably felt like in this moment they had nothing to offer God's mission, right? And yet they remained faithful And they did serve God when it came up. And in the face of pressure and a danger that they could not have expected, they become these unlikely heroes that help make God's plan of salvation for the Israelites in Egypt so much more real. Stan had an excellent sermon last week when I was gone about how there is no secular versus sacred, right? If you were here last week, I hope you heard that. If not, you should go back and watch it. Everything that we do is done in faith for the glory of God. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that nothing is done in vain. These women, they weren't priests, they weren't prophets. They had what we would see as they would see as a messy secular job, and yet they become lowercase s saviors of God's people. And it's a part of the plan. It's a bit of speculation, but if I did my math right, I think Aaron was 3 years older than Moses. You know Aaron, the guy who becomes the priest, Moses' older brother. It's about speculation, but I wonder if Aaron was on the chopping block for Pharaoh's decree in that day, and that Shiphrah and Puah helped save Aaron's life in their work. Even if not, the boys who would have been killed, these boys whose lives they saved, were the feet that later walked on dry ground between those walls of water on the Red Sea 80 years later, or maybe a little bit more than 80 years later, right? It was those boys that they saved and their children that God later saved. They were a part of that story and that journey because they did what was right in the face of incredible pressure and danger that they never would have expected would have come their way. And so I think the question here for us is, where has God placed you so that you can be that unlikely hero? If evil is constantly at work to damage God's good creation, and we would agree that it is, right? And if God is fully and timelessly at work to bless and combat against that evil, where has God placed you so that you can step up and partner with God for what is good? Where has he placed you? I think of Esther, right? Where has God placed you for such a time as this? Yeah, and Esther. Whether it's your workplace, your family, your neighborhood, your friend group, whatever, you are invited to be a hero in God's story by simply choosing to do whatever is right whenever and whatever may come. You are the tool that God is using to bring about his blessing and will into some corner of the world, right? In some corner of the world. You are in a position to crush a piece of the serpent, okay? You're in a position to crush a piece of the serpent. You may be, and it's funny because sometimes I feel like we wait on God to do some sort of miracle. We wait on God to do something. Meanwhile, he's sitting there waiting on us to do something. He said, hey, I put you there so that you can serve, so that you can be a force of godliness in your time and place. I know I've mentioned it a couple times, and allow me one more. God is strangely silent in the first 2 chapters of Exodus while a lot of awful things are going on. The enslavement and oppression of his people, later the genocide of the Hebrew baby boys. God, he doesn't say anything in those moments. He doesn't act in any dramatic fashion. But he is still at work through his faithful followers who know what is good, what is right, and are willing to fight against the darkness. You know how all the baby boys are thrown in the Nile and killed? You know how that happens? It's not the soldiers, necessarily, which is in my cartoon that I think of sometimes. It wasn't any more midwives that he was having throw the baby boys in the river. He tells all of Egypt to do it. It's a decree and something he puts out for all the nation. And you know what? They do it. They do it. All those deaths of those baby boys came from everyday people who followed their Pharaoh into the darkness. You see, darkness has no problem finding workers and allies. You probably know that to be true. Darkness has no problem finding workers and allies. Will we stand up to be agents of the light? Will we stand up to be agents of the light? And that's our mission, folks, to become unlikely heroes and workers in the kingdom of God so that our names, too, would be written down and remembered in ages to come, just like these 2 women. I pray that we would all be as brave and willing to serve as these 2 women were, that we would all become midwives, helping deliver the kingdom to come. If we can help you in any way this morning, we invite you to come now as we stand and as we sing.